Stephen, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So you are an anesthesiologist, a chief medical officer, and an ETA searcher.
That's right.
What do you enjoy most out of all three of those?
Well, I enjoy all three. Well, I'm an anesthesiologist. As you mentioned, that's my day job. That's what I've been doing the longest. Only recently a searcher in the last, I would say, year or so. I guess just to give you some background. So I work for a private practice anesthesia management company. We're a multi-state company. Essentially, we supply anesthesia providers to surgery centers and hospitals in 7 states now. More context, oftentimes hospitals and surgery centers don't employ their anesthesia providers. They'll employ their nurses, surgeons, but generally speaking, it's common to see a third-party group, such as our company, supply the anesthesia providers effectively, like vendors. Primarily because the billing side of anesthesia is a very niche space. And so hospitals and surgery centers don't want to have to deal with the headache of billing. There's some unique regulatory considerations around anesthesia billing. Depending on how deep you want to go into that, I can tell you. But otherwise, just know that they don't want to deal with that. So another issue is when you look at the economics around the labor market for anesthesia providers, the compensation that an anesthesia provider can demand nowadays is sky high. It's 30 to 40% higher than it was just a few years ago. So putting that hiring responsibility on the hospital or the surgery center is really tough. So they'd rather just outsource it to a vendor like us, and we supply the providers.
So start from the beginning. There's different types of anesthesiologists. There's surgery, emergency surgery. If you can walk us through what you are, your specialty, and the various different forms.
Yeah, sure. I went to anesthesiology residency at Massachusetts General Hospital. During anesthesia residency, you learn how to become a general anesthesiologist. In that curriculum, you learn how to deliver anesthesia care for all types of surgery, for all age groups: pediatric anesthesia, geriatrics, cardiac cases, open heart surgery, brain surgeries, neurosurgeries. Spend some time in the critical care environment, in the ICU, even in the outpatient setting, chronic pain medicine. So it's pretty wide range of subspecialties that you're exposed to during anesthesia residency. But generally speaking, after you finish anesthesia residency, you'll find yourself in a job where you're in kind of a more narrow lane. I actually ended up doing a fellowship, an additional year of training after anesthesia residency, to focus on one of the subspecialties that I was exposed to in anesthesia residency. And so that fellowship was regional anesthesia. Regional anesthesia is the branch of anesthesiology that strives to deliver local anesthetic medication to a specific region of the body. In other words, we have different nerve blocking techniques. I can inject numbing medicine in a specific region of your body to render that body part numb and ideally spare you from having to receive general anesthesia. So regional anesthesia is contrasted with general.
So a surgery versus an epidural?
So, close. It's a little more nuanced. There's general anesthesia, meaning you have generalized unconsciousness. There's neuraxial anesthesia, in reference to anesthesia administered in the spaces around the spinal cord. So that would include an epidural, like you mentioned, but also a spinal anesthetic. And then there's regional anesthesia, which I just mentioned. So, for example, I might find the nerves of your brachial plexus in your neck, inject some numbing medicine around it, and now your shoulder is numb. So you can have your shoulder operated on while you're completely awake. An epidural wouldn't be able to accomplish that. And then there's also local anesthesia, which is generally in reference to injecting numbing medicine not around a specific nerve, as would be the case for regional anesthesia, but just kind of generally in the tissues. You go to the dental office and they inject some numbing medicine in your mouth. That's more of like a local infiltration. So that's one way to categorize the different types of anesthesia.
I'd love to take us down the rabbit hole of consciousness. You operate in between consciousness and death. You're kind of, it's not a gray area, but you're within that spectrum. How do you train for that? How do you manage that? And specifically in residency, I've heard you go with 24, 36 hours of no sleep, and you're making life and death decisions.
You're right. You said it well. We have to basically bring patients to death's door, so to speak, or at least find that balance between keeping them awake enough so that it's a reversible coma that we've induced, but also still close enough, or I should say far enough from consciousness that they're not uncomfortable during surgery. It is a delicate balance, but to more directly answer your question, we hone the technical skills, by spending countless hours in the operating room during residency. And so, being in the operating room and doing literally thousands of surgical cases, anesthetic cases over and over, that's going to build that muscle and give you the tools that you need to be able to carry out the task. But there's also the psychological side, recognizing that if you do enough cases, there's going to be scenarios where you can't bring a patient back. Anesthesia residency, I wouldn't say is sufficient to prepare a provider for that worst case scenario. Psychologically, it's always going to take a toll emotionally if, you just got done spending time with the patient, meeting their family, telling them, you're going to take great care of them and they'll go home and have a smooth recovery, only to a couple of hours later have to deliver bad news to those same family members. Having said that, that's a very rare scenario. Fortunately, medicine and medical technology has advanced such that those scenarios are not common, fortunately, but it still happens.
What causes that underlying issue? Or is it random in some cases?
It could be due to multifarious reasons. It could be patient-specific factors. Maybe the patient isn't medically optimized for surgery, meaning that they have a chronic medical condition such as heart failure. And, a lot of these medical conditions, it's a spectrum. You can have a severe form of it, you can have a moderate form of it or mild. And oftentimes you can optimize that patient's physical status, not curing the disease, but help them transition from severe heart failure to a more moderate version of it. But if that optimization process doesn't happen, through medical management or an intermediary procedure that they need before they go and have their knee replacement done, then sometimes those patients don't do well under anesthesia because they weren't optimized. Otherwise, it could be due to surgical factors. A surgeon accidentally lacerates a blood vessel and the patient bleeds out. It could be due to the anesthesia provider. You give the wrong medication or the wrong dosage, and yeah, sometimes there's no place to assign blame. It's just a freak accident that no one anticipated. And that's always the worst, I would say. It's a healthy person. There's no obvious explanation for why this person didn't wake up from an anesthetic case that 99.9% of people wake up from, and you don't have an answer to account for why that adverse outcome happened.
Once you inject the medicine, what happens to the body? And are you constantly monitoring the dosage, or is it just one dose?
Sure. So really in our field of anesthesia, our work begins long before the patient even enters the operating theater. I kind of think about it as three phases. You have the preoperative phase, the intraoperative phase, and the postoperative phase of anesthesia. And so most people, when they think of anesthesia care delivery, they think of that intraoperative phase, meaning in the operating room. And so we'll get to that part. But before we even get into the operating room, I greet the patient in the preoperative area, ask very detailed questions about their medical history and surgical history, learn about the medications they take, what allergies they have, and look for any reason why they are not healthy enough or optimized sufficiently to undergo anesthesia or go under the knife. I'm kind of the gatekeeper of the operating room. And so you have to check so many boxes before I can say, okay, I think it's safe for you to proceed to surgery. So once we're past that phase, then to directly answer your question, they're in the operating room. They're lying flat on their back most of the time on the operating room table. And I'll give anesthetic medication in the IV, usually propofol. People recognize that drug as the Jackson juice. So
he had too much of that, right? Or what happened there?
Well, my understanding isn't that he necessarily had too much, but he wasn't properly monitored. And so, I could have, not me personally, but first of all, it wasn't an anesthesia provider administering it. It was a cardiologist, I believe. So that was a big issue. But I'm willing to bet that an anesthesia provider could have given the same dose per se, and maybe the bad outcome wouldn't have happened. But because he wasn't properly monitored, and we have several monitors that we look at in the operating room. But yeah, I give propofol and the patient goes to sleep within 15 seconds or so once I give that dose. And I'm not constantly measuring the dosage. So there's an IV sedative hypnotic that we give. That's the propofol. And then we usually secure the airway with a breathing device, often a breathing tube. and connect that breathing tube to the anesthesia machine, which allows us to dial in anesthesia gases. There's a knob that we turn. You can deliver anesthesia gas. So that flows from the anesthesia machine or ventilator through the tube, and the patient is breathing the anesthesia gas to remain asleep. And then during that step, we are technically measuring the concentration of the gas to see how asleep they are.
And throughout this process, they're not conscious, they're not dead. Are they dreaming? Is it like sleep that we all experience every night? I'm just very curious on what makes us conscious. Is it the light that we see that reflects off our eyes? And what makes us asleep? What makes dreams? And you play in this area.
That's right. Well, I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. Some patients have described having dreams while under anesthesia. And then to address the other thing that you said, there's kind of a scientific answer, but there's also you're kind of raising a philosophical question as well when you ask, what's consciousness? Some debate if there is such a thing. But they've looked at EEG studies, the brain waves while a person is under anesthesia versus while sleeping. And they've observed that the EEG pattern is not exactly the same. So although externally it might appear that the person is simply sleeping, but in terms of what's happening in the brain, it's not exactly the same. Colloquially speaking, we just say, you're going to go to sleep under anesthesia. But to be precise, it's more of a medically induced coma that is not the same as sleeping per se. But in any case, yes, the patient is unconscious and not aware of what's going on.
Do you see any technology like AI taking over or integrated into your daily work or monitoring, or do you see eventually a figure or Tesla robot replacing you?
So in present time, I have not seen that. And if you mean like in the future, do I foresee it? I'll never say never. It is hard to imagine though, because I think what the scientists and inventors would have to figure out is how to combine this AI software with the hardware and have that robot essentially be able to react in real time. And there's so many different scenarios that could arise that I imagine it would be hard to build logic around it, especially when you consider that there's, anatomical variation from person to person, not to mention the medical legal implication. If the robot doesn't do what it's supposed to do in the exact moment in time, and there's a bad outcome, how do you account for that? How do you answer for that? So it is hard for me to imagine, but having said that, I won't say never. So we'll see.
Is there a chance, say Elon makes it to Mars, is there a chance that you can remotely operate your abilities?
So I guess maybe to clarify what I've said so far, there are some aspects of what we do that can certainly be automated. A large part of what we do happens in the operating room, in the intraoperative phase, as I mentioned earlier. We're watching vital signs. We're looking for trends. We're looking for triggers to say, okay, the blood pressure has reached this number. I should probably give a medication that brings up the medication. Otherwise, it might go too low. And so I can imagine, a robot being able to do those types of things. But I'm thinking of those really rare but high stakes edge cases in which you need someone to intervene and make the right decision with only seconds, because it's a matter of life and death. And just to give a quick example, let's say it's a spine surgery and I've intubated the patient, meaning I placed the breathing tube in the mouth after I induced anesthesia, But for a spine surgery, a posterior spine surgery, that means the patient is on their belly for the procedure, because the surgeon has to operate on the back, of course. And if for whatever reason, or let's say I'm looking at the vitals monitor and I see the oxygen levels are going low. It's supposed to be in the high 90s percentage wise, and then it drops to 90%, then 80%, then 70%. So now I'm getting nervous because, the body or the brain in particular can only be in an anaerobic environment or low oxygen environment for so long before there's irreversible damage. And so I'm thinking, okay, I'm going through algorithms in my head. Let's say I ultimately conclude within those 10 seconds, that breathing tube probably fell out. The patient's face down, the breathing tube probably got dislodged. I just don't imagine a robot being able to flip the patient back over to their backside, troubleshoot the airway, remove the breathing tube, figure out what was wrong with the breathing tube, grab a new one, and place it successfully in the nick of time. That's the kind of scenario that I imagine when I say we're far off from that.
And do you have to say that second air tube isn't working? Do you have to bring them out of the coma? Can you do that immediately?
Usually not immediately, but yeah, that is one way to handle it. Wake the patient up if you have difficulty with the airway. That's part of our, algorithms that we think through. Otherwise, I would just focus on, I wouldn't do that as a first step. I would try to secure the airway with either a different breathing tube. It's usually not the breathing tube itself that's the issue. It's usually not like a defective tube or anything. Most of the time, it's some anatomical variation that makes it difficult to place the tube in the first place. So I would find some other device like a video laryngoscope to help me see the vocal cords and make sure that tube is in the right place. Again, hard for a robot to do.
You've seen good outcomes. You've seen bad outcomes. Have you had any experiences that were near-death experiences? People come back and say they saw X, Y, or Z.
So I've heard patients describe that phenomenon. They weren't my own patients. What I mean by that is, I guess I have to give some background information. As anesthesia providers, unlike a primary care physician or a psychiatrist or even a surgeon, we don't typically have a longitudinal relationship with the patient. We meet them on their day of surgery for the first time and oftentimes never see them ever again. And so I have had patients tell me like, hey, last time I had some other anesthesiologist and I woke up during surgery and I heard talking and I saw this and that. And so I try to give them reassurance that that won't happen on my watch. But otherwise, yeah, I've also heard patients say that they've had near-death experiences and they saw the light and things like that. But not my personal patients who I watched have the near-death experience and then later had a chance to interview them to hear those things. I haven't experienced that.
So they don't wake up until they're in a recovery room, right? So you don't even see them when
That's
they wake
right.
up. Okay, that makes sense.
I do see them in the recovery room. I guess I didn't finish that framework I laid out earlier: pre-op, intra-op, and post-op. So the last phase is post-operative care, and that's the recovery room that you mentioned. And so I'll round in the post-anesthesia care unit and make sure that they're not nauseous and that they're pain-free. But it's still a short interaction, not long enough to get the full story about their anesthesia experience.
Yeah, so there is the horror stories of they can feel pain, but they can't speak are true.
That is true. Yeah, it's a phenomenon called intraoperative awareness. It's pretty rare. Less than 1% of the time would that happen. A step that I skipped over earlier, we give them the propofol and the IV, and we do put them on the ventilator in order for us to effectively administer oxygen and allow the patient to breathe on the ventilator. We have to paralyze the patient. And so we literally give a muscle relaxant or paralytic medication in the IV. And so that patient is incapable of breathing on their own. The diaphragm muscle is paralyzed. Furthermore, every muscle in their body is paralyzed. And so you can conceive a scenario where the anesthetic medication has worn off, but the paralytic medication has not. And so you're effectively locked into your body, experiencing the pain and feeling it, but not being able to move or communicate that to anyone.
Man, that sounds terrible.
Yeah.
I'm hoping
none of my patients have experienced it.
Yeah. Wow. That's, that sounds terrible. When did they start? How did they find out this is possible? I understand there's medical research, but how do you try this out? What is it tried on animals? When was this done?
I don't know all the details around that, but I can tell you that the first demonstration of the use of an anesthetic for surgery was in October of 1846 in Boston, Massachusetts, and it was a public demonstration. And I forget exactly what the procedure was, but the history of anesthesia is very interesting. At one point they were using ether and then more sophisticated anesthetic gases and propofol we mentioned. But yeah, at a certain point, I guess you just have to try it on someone and see what the effect is.
Chris, can you pull up when the first, or how they figured this out, what they tested this on? This is super interesting because we look at the 1700s, 1800s in the wild, wild west, drink some good bourbon and bite down on a wooden spoon, right? And that's how they amputated a leg. So really, there wasn't general surgery performed until 1948 using anesthesia?
1846, I believe.
1840.
Yep.
1846.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Chris, did you find anything on that?
I found some stuff. Let me share my screen.
I think it was Dr. Morton, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that sounds familiar. 1846.
There we go. It'd help if I could spell anesthesia.
The earliest effects, anesthesia involved natural sedatives. Okay, so alcohol. Yeah. Okay. Opium. 4000 BC. They were using opium. And so opium is just I guess a nerve blocker. That's what.
Not a nerve blocker. It's more of it's a painkiller, an analgesic, but it blocks the receptors in the body called opioid receptors. Nerve blocking implies that, you're preventing conduction of the pain sensory information that, travels between the brain and that body part. But yeah, this one just kind of changes your perception around the pain stimulus. Opioids do.
And you're right here. William T.G. Morton successfully demonstrated the first use of inhaled. Okay, so they inhaled it, just like you were talking about. And then, interesting. Wow. Okay. So all of this to say, how did you know you wanted to get into this field? I would love to hear your journey.
Sure. Actually, in 4th grade, I had a substitute teacher, Mrs. Plotner. He recommended a book to me. It was called Think Big, written by Dr. Benjamin Carson. You might recognize him as, he's a politician now, but he was also, I believe, the first neurosurgeon to separate Siamese twins conjoined at the head. Long story short, I read the book, told my mother about it. I was inspired by his story and said, I want to be a neurosurgeon just like Dr. Ben Carson. And since that time, changed from neurosurgeon to orthopedic surgeon. I played basketball in high school. I thought I wanted to do sports medicine at one point, but it wasn't until I got to medical school that I experienced the various specialties. You have to do that as part of your rotations. And so I had some exposure to anesthesia during that time and fell in love with it. I still enjoyed being in the operating room. As a surgeon, you would be in the operating rooms. I like the fact that anesthesia providers are also in the operating room, but it feels a little bit more cerebral rather than mechanical. When you're a surgeon, a knee replacement, maybe the first few times is exciting, but after a while, it can kind of feel repetitive. At least that was my experience. And so I like that the anesthesia provider got to get their hands dirty, so to speak, by doing a variety of procedures, maybe not as long as a 2-hour surgery, but I place epidurals, spinals, central lines, arterial lines, IVs, intubations, etc. So I do my fair share of procedures, but I also am still responsible for the medical knowledge that I gained in medical school. I have to know something about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I have to know about diabetes, hypothyroidism, serotonin syndrome, some obscure diseases. I don't have to part ways with that knowledge as I likely would if I had become a surgeon. Not to say that surgeons don't know as much. They know far more in very specific areas, and I don't have that knowledge either. So everyone who commits to a specialty has to give up some knowledge, but I just like that the anesthesiologist still had to have a good grasp of medical topics. And so you're sort of like the internal medicine doctor of the operating room environment, and you still get to do procedures. And it's a pretty good work lifestyle balance and well compensated. So I think it was overall the best fit for me.
So where did you grow up?
Grew up in Ohio, from Akron, Ohio, LeBron town. Was there until I went away for residency. So I did medical school in Ohio as well, Northeast Ohio Medical University. I did a 6-year path, 2 years for the bachelor's degree, 4 years for medical school. Typically it's 4 and 4, but this was an accelerated program. After that, went on to Boston, Massachusetts, Massachusetts General Hospital, where Dr. Morton did the demonstration, and then went out to San Diego, UCSD, to do the fellowship I mentioned earlier in regional anesthesia. And now I'm in Dallas, Fort Worth, practicing. I've been here for the last 5 years.
You're a chief medical officer. What does that entail? And then you're still a practicing anesthesiologist. So you're kind of wearing 2 hats there. What is your day-to-day of chief medical officer, and what does your day-to-day look like for an anesthesiologist?
As chief medical officer, I sort of take ownership of the clinical and cultural integrity of the whole enterprise. What I mean by that is, we have a few hundred providers. We're in 7 different states. When I started, we were just in Texas and only had a handful of providers. And so, the risk of growing and scaling a company is that the culture can become diluted. We have providers in Pennsylvania, Florida, St. Louis. I'm in Dallas, but providers in Houston and Austin and San Antonio. So how do we make sure that the culture remains consistent? It's sort of like I think about Chick-fil-A as an example. I think they were founded in Georgia, but you can go to a Chick-fil-A in California and they're still going to be pleasant and say it's my pleasure, and it kind of feels like the culture, it doesn't feel diluted even though they're far away from where they began. And so in one capacity, my job as CMO is to make sure we have the same consistency in terms of culture across all of our sites, all of our providers. And so how do I accomplish that? Being high touch with our providers, also high touch with the facility administrators. So the leaders of the hospitals we partner with, the leaders of the surgery centers we partner with, participating in meetings, liaising between those regional facilities and our corporate office. And then enough of the culture side. On the clinical side, in terms of clinical governance, I ensure that our medical policies are accurate and up-to-date, evidence-based. I kind of establish some uniformity in the way that we deliver care as an organization. I make sure we're on the cutting edge of technology and best practices. So that's what I do when I'm wearing my CMO hat, and that's 2 to 3 days a week. I mean, I'm CMO in general, but I'm in the office, I should say, 2 to 3 days a week. And then I'm in the operating room as a practicing anesthesiologist, again, 2 to 3 days a week.
So you're really quality control. That's your main focus as CMO, is quality control, making sure that the customer feels the same, whether they are in Dallas, Philadelphia. Now, this is just national, it's not international, correct?
Correct.
And so your day-to-day is really like a franchisor, making sure that there's the same standards and quality with the franchisee, if you will.
Absolutely. Yep. Well said.
Okay. And so wearing both of those hats, where does CMO take Stephen in the next 10 years? And where does anesthesiology take Stephen in the next 10 years?
The current company that I'm with, OrthoMed Anesthesia, like I said, when I joined, we were effectively a startup, very small. And we've grown in a short amount of time. But again, it's only been a short amount of time. And so I think we still have a lot of room to continue growing. And so I say that to say, in one scenario, I don't think it's outside the question to see myself still within the OrthoMed organization, maybe wearing a different hat, but nevertheless leading the organization. Otherwise, I know in the beginning of the talk, we talked about my ETA goals. Maybe in 10 years, hopefully in 10 years, I'll be well along in that journey. So having said that, I don't plan to ever give up my anesthesia skill. I spent a lot of time and money learning those skills. And so I would like to maintain that for as long as I can, even if that means only practicing in the operating room a couple of times a month or, a lower frequency.
Before we segue into ETA, which is really important, what motivates you to getting up every single day and wanting to do this? Earlier, you alluded to, you love this. You fell in love with this. It's a super high stress job. And I can tell that you love that you don't wake up and do the same repetitive thing every day. And this keeps you on your toes. This is operating at the highest levels. You're functioning cognitively and firing on all cylinders at all times. Is this adrenaline for you? Is it an addiction? What motivates you? And then also, what gives you the satisfaction at the end of the day to say that was a good day?
First and foremost, I think I just really enjoy connecting with people, meeting new people. And that's what we do as physicians in general. That's not unique to the field of anesthesia, but something that I think is a little more unique to my field is not only connecting with a person, but earning their trust in a very unique situation. The situation being oftentimes it's the scariest day of their lives. It's a huge milestone day for them. It's very high stakes. And in a short amount of time, you have to be able to connect with the person, earn their trust, and essentially convince them to temporarily hand over their life to you. And that's pretty rewarding to be able to have that honor and privilege every day. And so that's certainly a motivator. And I always say, when I come home, my wife asks me, "How was your day?" I say, "It was a great day. Everybody lived." And so to answer your question, that's how I measure a good day. Everybody gets to wake up and go back home to their families or continue their lives. No matter how long the hours were for me, I still try to remember the patients first and say, well, today was a hard day. I can still keep it real and say that, but it was still a good day. because everybody.
Absolutely. I love that. So you're wearing two hats already. You're finding time to join the many ETAers out there. And ETA is Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition. What got you interested in that? What does your process look like now? And have you had any acquisitions or any luck with deal flow, LOIs, anything along those lines?
Yeah, sure. So, I don't know if we said it out loud yet for the listeners. You and I, we went to Wharton together, classmates. And so it was in that Wharton environment that I first had exposure to even the concept of ETA. I had never heard that term. I didn't know what it was. So after taking courses with professors like Professor Chalfin and the ETA professor, entrepreneurship with Professor Rye, I really kind of got that entrepreneurial bug. And so I've just been obsessed with it ever since. Furthermore, before I answer more parts of your question, I came home, told my wife about it. She also was fascinated by the idea of acquiring a business, an existing business. She was doing Wall Street prep courses, learning more about finance and accounting and trying to figure out ways that we can, use our skills to accomplish something great. So now we're both all in. I'm still working, full time, my day job, but it's nice to have my wife as an extension of me out there helping me look for deals, scoping out opportunities. To answer your question, I have not successfully consummated a deal yet, but I think this has still been a valuable time for me. I've been learning how to remain disciplined in the search. I don't want to force a deal. And so I think that I've been really using this time to kind of build pattern recognition skills, getting my reps in. I'll reach out to brokers, navigate those conversations. I've met with sellers several times, submitted plenty of LOIs. And so these different parts of the processes I've been able to do over and over and kind of, like I said, get those reps in, which I think will serve me well when I ultimately end up finding the right opportunity.
Did you have any exposure to entrepreneurship when you were growing up?
I didn't. No, I was raised by my mother. She was a single mother. She worked one, sometimes two jobs, but they were 9 to 5, W-2 jobs. She did a great job, but nevertheless, I didn't have any exposure to entrepreneurship. I didn't see anyone around me founding businesses or running businesses. The idea of owning something wasn't top of my priority list. And so, it was a foreign world to me.
It really hit home when you went to Wharton and you gained all those skills. That's awesome that your wife is doing that with you in the search. What does your deal flow pipeline look like? You said brokers. Are you actually calling businesses and saying, "Hey, I'm Steven. I want to buy your business. I'm not private equity. I'm a single searcher." What does deal flow look like for you?
I think that's honestly been the most challenging part of all of this. Sourcing deals, sourcing high quality deals at that. I've primarily relied on, the broker mediated platforms like Biz Buy Sell. Saw some interesting opportunities on there, but it feels like I have to filter through, 100 listings before I find even a couple that I think are worthwhile. And so to answer your question, I haven't done much proprietary outreach, but I think that that's a good path to take. I think when I first decided that I wanted to become an ETA searcher, my aperture was way too large. My funnel was way too wide. I didn't have any focus. And so I think that resulted in some wasted time. But now that I'm kind of narrowing my scope and figuring out exactly what kind of business, or at least the industry that I'm interested in, I think that it might make more sense to do more, outreach and directly call some potential sellers or find out if they're interested in selling. So moving forward, that'll be a part of my deal flow strategy.
Are you looking within the state of Texas, within your area in Dallas? Or are you looking nationally?
I am looking within Texas. I think that fortunately, Texas having the big economy that it does and the traffic that it does, that there should be an opportunity here. And so hopefully I don't have to venture out too far outside of the state. Otherwise, if I did live somewhere else, I'd probably be open to pursuing an opportunity outside of my state. But I think within Texas, if not DFW alone, there should be an opportunity that I can pounce on.
What I've heard people do is they kind of cruise these sites or talk to brokers to find deal flow, just exactly what you're doing. And then if it looks good, you go under NDA, you get access to the data room. From the data room, what are you looking for from your perspective, from a Wharton perspective? What highlights are you looking at to say, okay, this could make sense. I want to do more due diligence in the LOI?
I'm looking at, the financial statements. Oftentimes these are company prepared financial statements. So to be honest, I take that with a grain of salt. Ultimately, I would want to, corroborate what I see with tax returns. But nevertheless, I'm going to look at the financial statements to see if this opportunity even makes financial sense. I'll look at things like customer concentration, meaning, if a large percentage of the revenue for a given company is coming from the top one or two clients, that's a red flag for me. Of course, there's inherent risk. What if you lose one of those clients or a couple of those clients? That's a huge hit on the revenue. And so ideally, I would see a wider variance in terms of how the revenue is coming in as compared to the number of clients that the company has. I look at owner dependency. So, is this business only successful because this owner has a lot of personal contacts with the suppliers, or essentially, is this business going to fare well once the owner leaves? And so I tend to shy away from opportunities where the owner is the business. I look for profitable businesses. That goes back to my first point, but I guess I didn't double click on that. When I'm looking at the financial statements, I want a business that's profitable. I want a business that has stable cash flow. I prefer a business that doesn't have too much seasonality or, any risk in the stability of the cash flows that are coming in. Yeah, I think at a high level, I'm sure I'm missing some things, but at a high level, those are some of the things that I look at.
Yeah, same. And once I get access to the data room, I do exactly what you're talking about. Customer concentration, that's a big red flag. Yeah, the relationships, are they gonna follow the owner? Are they gonna, is he gonna introduce or she gonna introduce? Did you take Kevin Kaiser's class?
I had Jules.
Okay. I took corporate restructuring. Chris, I think you took it with us as well. If you can pull up Kevin Kaiser's free cash flow versus EBITDA. And so I've really been following this, and it's really interesting because everybody bases a purchase price off of EBITDA. But Kevin Kaiser is saying no, because you can add back whatever you want into EBITDA. It has to go off of free cash flow.
Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't end up taking that class, but it makes sense when you think about classic finance theory. The drivers of valuation primarily is going to be your cash flow, the growth rate of the company, and then, the inherent risk or the discount rate. I remember, I think it was Gordon's growth model that specifically looked at the dividend in the numerator, as a proxy for the, cash flow, but you're dividing the dividend by the discount rate plus the growth rate. So those are the primary drivers for sure.
EBITDA, the surface view. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Is often called operating cash flow by analysts, but Kaiser argues that this is a misnomer. What it represents, the raw earning power of assets before accounting for capital structure or taxes. The flaw, it ignores maintenance costs of staying in business. Kaiser famously emphasizes that depreciation is a real economic cost. Even though it's not a cash accounting entry, it represents the wear and tear on assets that must eventually be replaced. This is super interesting because I'm looking at labor and kind of CapEx heavy businesses, like it could, have trucks or tractors or trailers. And this is exactly what he's talking about. Working capital. EBITDA doesn't care if your cash is tied up in unpaid invoices, accounts receivable, or piles of unsold stock inventory. Free cash flow accounts for this trapped cash. Super interesting. The idea here, I think, is to dive a little bit deeper than your average searcher so that you can find out a few things before you pull the trigger on taking on debt or using your own capital. And then you're kind of working your way out of something when you could have either projected that or have saw that earlier.
Absolutely.
Now you have determined that this is a viable business and it looks good. You've talked with the seller. Now you move to LOI. It's a letter of intent that you want to buy the business. What do you look for when LOI is signed?
At this stage, I'm asking the seller if he or she feels comfortable sharing the tax returns so I can, do some proper due diligence and kind of, compare the company prepared financials to something more official. I haven't officially done this next thing yet, but I've at least considered a couple times hiring someone to help me do quality of earnings, a QOE, again, just to make sure that what's represented in the SIM, the confidential information memorandum or the data room, make sure that all those numbers have integrity. I'm also asking for opportunities to come on site if the seller feels comfortable. Oftentimes they don't want to alarm their current employees that a change of ownership is imminent. And so, I'm respectful of that. But if they offer the opportunity, I'll come in and do a walkthrough, a tour, meet key people if allowed. I'm also thinking about, what specific terms I would want. Ultimately, if we're able to consummate a deal, or more specifically, contract language around representations and warranties, indemnification. I don't want to sign the dotted line only to find that, actually, this expensive asset needs to be fixed, or this supplier actually is ending the contract as soon as you take over. So, we have to protect ourselves. But those are the things that are kind of on my mind at a high level.
What businesses or sector are you specifically looking into?
Predominantly looking at service industries, HVAC, plumbing, electrical. That's what I'm primarily focused on. I think there's a lot of alignment between those industries and what I'm currently doing. I mean, the anesthesia industry is effectively a service industry. There's no products that we're selling. We're supplying labor, employing labor to do a job. And so it would effectively be the same. I've had a chance to observe how you can create value through operational leverage, optimizing your hiring, retention, culture control, things that we've talked about earlier in the conversation. A lot of those things can really create value and be impactful. And so I think that I can translate those skills to another service industry.
In regards to deploying labor, same thing, directly translatable to plumbers, to any of these service, right? You're deploying labor.
Yeah.
And so you have direct experience doing that. Does that mean that you would have to give up one of the hats that you're wearing? Say you buy, and I'm making this up, say you buy a plumbing company that's doing $2 million in revenue and its EBITDA is, say, 700, 800. And it has a current GM in place. Everything's paid for. What does Steven do when you acquire that business? And obviously you have to contingency plan if the GM leaves, if there's licensing, right? Who's holding the plumbing license and what are you operating that off of? Is there a retention contract there? What does that all look like? And specifically, do you have to give up one of your other hats as CMO or anesthesiologist?
I've thought about this. The short answer is no, I don't have to. And I think going back to what I said earlier, I'm really in a blessed position to have a wife who is equally excited about these ETA ventures. In my case, the goal is for my wife to actually take the lead. Obviously, we're a team, but she'll take the lead. She'll be the GM if the existing GM leaves. She has the energy and enthusiasm to not just be an investor, but to be an operator in the business. I do as well, but I also think about opportunity costs, and I think I wouldn't want to walk away from what I currently have going for me. It's going really well. I think we still have a lot more work to do and more to accomplish. I don't foresee myself walking away from my current job, but we're a team, my wife and I, and she would hop in and sit in the driver's seat.
That's an amazing resource to have. Because as you mentioned earlier, you're not going to give up anesthesiology. This is what you love to do. But I think once you acquire a business and you, again, example, if you take it from $1 million to $2 million in revenue, or even $1 million to $3 million, and it's successful and you exit, you want to do it again, right? And it's an addiction, and it's now a game of how can I acquire something and take it to an exit that's bigger, cash flow it and keep it in my portfolio and start to build legacy wealth. There's going to be a point where do you start your own practice that, what you're doing in anesthesiology, or do you have two cash flowing businesses and then another business that holds the real estate portfolio and then another that is employing searchers, and then another that is kind of churning these businesses out.
You're right. There are a lot of different paths that I could take. Yeah, it's a fortunate position to be in to, even have to decide between those options. I'm just trying to get that first one. And then once we can get that ball rolling, take it from there. But although, like I said, I've been searching for about a year or so, although I haven't found anything yet, I haven't lost any momentum. Still feeling encouraged. And yeah, the goal is to start with one and, multiply.
Did any of your deals fall through because of the counterparty?
Yes. One particular example I can point to, without going into all the details, he wasn't willing to show his tax returns or the company's tax returns. And it was frustrating because, the first few weeks or so, we had gone back and forth, had extensive conversations. There was some alignment between my current role and skill set and what the business actually was. But we were able to agree on a price even, actually. He wasn't willing to show the tax returns. And that just was a red flag for me. Maybe for someone else, it wouldn't be. I'm sure there have been plenty of successful transactions in which the seller didn't show them. But for me, that's something that I would want to see, especially spending that kind of money.
If somebody's not willing to show their tax returns, there's a massive red flag. It's interesting that people want to sell but won't give you proper paperwork. Are you reading books on this, or did you get all of this information? How'd you know that was a red flag? Was it just kind of a gut feeling? Did you do research on it?
I still have my notes from, the classes we took in Wharton. So that's probably been the biggest resource. Otherwise, I listen to some YouTubers on the topic. There's some good information out there. Read articles here and there. There's not really a single resource that I could point to and say that most of my knowledge came from there, but also just lived experience. After that negative interaction, moving forward, when I interact with sellers pretty early on in the process now, so I don't waste time, I ask, at some point, would you be willing to share tax returns? Not necessarily today, but then I'll know much sooner so that we don't, waste time. So,
so you're optimizing the process and you'll get to a point where it's kind of rinse and repeat.
Exactly. Yep.
Is there more due diligence in the medical sector?
Yeah. So, disclosure, I haven't attempted to buy any healthcare businesses or anything like that, but I've still had some exposure working in this space. Just for example, medical billing at a high level. How do medical practices make money? They're not collecting money from the consumers that they serve, the patient. It's not like the patient digs into their wallet and hands over money or swipes their card, or at least not in anesthesia. That's not how it works. You have to actually negotiate with the patient's insurance company, or the insurers, also called payers. And so it can be very difficult to value a healthcare company. I'll say an anesthesia company specifically, because I might do an anesthesia case tomorrow, which I will, but I'll do that anesthesia case and our anesthesia company won't see any revenue or reimbursement from the care that I delivered until 9 months from now. So we have very long DSOs, accounts receivables pile up. But during those 9 months, what's happening? We are reaching out to the patient's insurance company saying, hey, we just did anesthesia for your patient's knee surgery. Can you pay us for the work that we did? The default response from the insurance company is, no, we're not going to pay you for that. Yeah, you did that for free. That's not literally what they say, but effectively they won't pay. And so then it has to go through arbitration. And so there's an arbitrator who gets involved and says, you should pay them because they did the work. And then after there's a judgment, this is a few months that go by, then the insurer will finally say, okay, we capitulate, we'll pay you. But then even still, after they agree to pay, they still won't pay, or they'll take a few more months. And so there's not much oversight or pressure for the payer to actually give you money. And so I give you that background so that you can imagine, if you're trying to buy, say, an anesthesia company and they tell you, well, we should be worth this much. And then you look at the aging of their accounts receivables and you're thinking, I'm not sure that you guys are worth that much. You're not even collecting the money for the revenue for the work you're doing.
Yeah. Do you count the arbitrator drag on the margin? I mean, do you automatically discount that out?
Yeah. So I would answer that a couple ways. more directly, it does ultimately hit the bottom line because there's an arbitrator fee. And so, that is an actual cost. It's a nominal amount, but nevertheless, that is a cost. And, that's built into our financial model. But the other way I would answer that is saying not all anesthesia companies have to go down this path. This path that I'm describing is very niche. It's specifically in the context where the anesthesia group is out of network with the insurance company. And so if the anesthesia group is in network, they don't need to go through this pathway. But as a strategy, anesthesia groups will deliberately remain out of network because you can get higher reimbursement rates if you're willing to wait long enough to collect on your money. But having said that, there's also inherent risk there. Any change to the regulatory environment or any regulatory headwinds could eliminate this as a viable path for a lot of anesthesia groups. And so because of that, sometimes anesthesia groups that choose to be out of network might be valued a little bit lower. There might be a higher discount rate because there's more risk. It's not as secure, stable, predictable in terms of cash flow as it would be for an anesthesia group that's in network, where you have those contracts with the commercial insurers.
Is there any future where it goes to cash and just bypasses insurance? I know a lot of physicians or providers are moving to this cash or subscription model and just getting rid of the billing department and the insurance side of things, just because it's such a hassle, takes too long. Their accounts receivable is 9 months.
Right.
Is there a way, as you mentioned, a direct consumer is not paying the anesthesiologist, it's negotiated with the insurance. Is there a way that can be negotiated with the hospital directly?
Yes. Actually, it used to be this way. There are different arrangements that you can see, but previous as in pre-2022, I believe, patients were billed directly. And there are pros and cons to that, but there was some legislation called the No Surprises Act that was passed on January 1st of 2022. And that basically meant, well, to give you context, let's say a patient's going to have knee surgery tomorrow. It costs $1,000 for the anesthesia portion, we'll say. And so the insurance company says, well, we're only going to pay $100, take it or leave it. So then the anesthesia group would balance bill the patient, meaning, bill the patient for $900, the remaining balance of the cost. And so that burden fell on the patient, and patients didn't like that, understandably so, because they didn't budget for that. They didn't think they'd have a surprise bill, hence the No Surprises Act that was passed. And so now I think that on the one hand, the No Surprises Act, NSA, as we call it, was a good thing because patients shouldn't be caught in the middle of all of this. They shouldn't be balanced billed, but an unintended consequence of the No Surprises Act is that now there's this broken payment structure that's inefficient, and it's hurting the providers. It's taken several months for us to get paid. That cash flow could be deployed elsewhere, but it's just tied up into this inefficient process. So to answer your question, could it come to that? Directly billing patients, that's where we were before. We had problems with that. We thought we were moving in the right direction, and now we're just dealing with new issues.
Is there any startups focused on this area, trying to solve this problem of payment structure or?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our company, actually, OrthoMed, one of our differentiators is that we're not only an anesthesia practice management company. We don't just supply anesthesia providers. We also do in-house billing. So oftentimes anesthesia groups will outsource the billing to a third party, and that third party is responsible for this NSA arbitration pathway that I described. At OrthoMed, we do our own billing, and we've become really good at it among all the anesthesia groups in the country. Actually, CMS reported that we were the number one winners when it came to arbitration. So that's really one of our competitive advantages. Thanks. So we make sure we get paid.
That's great. Wow. So you really have a big role making sure that the quality and the reputation stays as chief medical officer.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, from fourth grade when you wanted to become a physician to just a few years ago, going through COVID, what made you decide to go to business school? And have you seen net gain on the knowledge that you have from that? Can you implement that daily?
Yeah. So this was around, I finished my anesthesia training in 2020. And in 2021, or near the end of 2021, I just finished, the biggest exam in the anesthesia world, which is our oral boards exam. And so the day after celebrating and saying, I'm never going to have to take another exam again, finally done with school and training, then it was, that following Monday that my boss, actually, the founder and CEO of our company, also formerly a practicing anesthesiologist, but he said to me, have you ever thought about going to business school? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, it's just something to think about, maybe something to consider. And long story short, I owe it to him. He saw something in me that I didn't. I wasn't thinking about business or entrepreneurship or anything like that. But he helped me see the vision. He told me that he could imagine me playing a much bigger role in the company, especially as we continue to grow and expand. And remember, this is, back in 2021. So we were still just a very small group. And I thought that we would remain that way. I was fine with that, actually. But I thought about his words more and ultimately decided to apply and got in. And then since going to business school, I've certainly seen the dividends. Answer that in a few ways. One, on a personal level, I just love to learn. And so it was really special to sit in classes and learn about topics I'd never thought of, studied accounting or finance or marketing or anything like that. But it just was refreshing to me to be exposed to new topics and new content as a lover of learning. That in itself already made it worth it for me. But to add some tangible value to it, I was able to bring back some of what I learned to our company. Now if I have an idea for a clinical initiative or otherwise, I'm not just pitching the idea and seeing, how the board reacts to it, but now I'm pitching the idea, the business model, building the financial model, helping them appreciate that this is a positive NPV project, and they're actually saying, yeah, go ahead and do it. We'll give you the funds and resources to make this happen. For example, within our field, simulation is important, meaning simulating crisis scenarios. So anesthesia providers will oftentimes go to some simulator environment, maybe on a weekend, and pay money to do an 8-hour course and earn some continuing education credit, but also, again, gain some skills so that they can stay sharp in the event that a crisis scenario arises in real life. And so I pitched the idea of, creating our own simulator in-house, which is pretty uncommon because typically you'll have a simulation program at an academic institution, not really in a private practice setting, which is where I work. But nevertheless, I pitched the idea. Long story short, we I bought the mannequin and built the OR inside of our corporate office. And we haven't rolled out the program yet, but we got endorsed by the National Society for our field, the ASA, American Society of Anesthesiologists. And so we have an official simulator lab, and we'll open it up to the public hopefully this summer.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on that. That's great. So you're able to effectively articulate the value, quantify it, sell it, and then execute on it.
Absolutely. And just another quick example, I find myself now interfacing more with the finance team than before I went to school. I mean, for example, when we enter a contract with a new facility and say, hey, we'll be your anesthesia provider, we're not just indiscriminately saying yes to every contract for the sake of growing. You have to, discern which contracts make sense to pursue and which ones don't. And so now I've had the opportunity to actually build the model and, conclude whether or not it makes economic sense to enter a contract with a given hospital or surgery center. And so I'm looking at the revenue drivers, I'm looking at what our staffing model is, how many CRNAs, nurse anesthetists, or anesthesiologists it would take to staff this facility, how many operating rooms do they have, what percentage of their patients have commercial insurance versus Medicare, and, building the model and then reporting, okay, the expected EBITDA margin would be X. And so I think that we should pursue this opportunity. I had no chance of figuring out how to do something like that before business school.
I think I remember you telling me that you taught yourself Mandarin.
That's right. Yeah.
So you taught yourself how to speak Mandarin. You also taught yourself about, and I think you're licensed in insurance.
That's right. Yeah, life insurance. That's correct.
So
Good memory.
Yeah. Do you have this incredible photographic memory? How do you retain this information? Is it just you're hyper focused and you're super interested in what you're looking at, reading about? I just would love to hear why you taught yourself Mandarin and why you got licensed to sell life insurance.
I maybe have a slightly better than average memory, but I don't think I have like a superpower or any sort of genius or anything like that. I have a good memory, to answer your question, but I don't think that fully explains, why I was able to learn Mandarin or the other things that you mentioned. I think you already hit the nail on the head. When I'm really passionate about something or engrossed in a topic, I get really obsessed with it. If I'm really interested in something, I can sit down and read and not realize that, several hours went by and I missed lunch and dinner. And so I think because of that sort of intrinsic motivation, it allows me to remember those things. I'm just like anyone else. If I'm not interested in something and I hear it, I probably won't remember, I won't remember what that lecture was about or the thing that I read. But I guess I just have unusual hobbies that I'm fascinated by. And so, some people find it impressive, but, everyone has their thing that they're locked into. For me, it's foreign languages. For someone else, it might be something else. So that's the first thing I'll say. Mandarin specifically, well, I'll start by saying I think because I grew up as an only child, I had to learn how to kind of keep myself entertained. And so I would gravitate towards hobbies that could be done by yourself. You didn't need another person for it, something mentally stimulating. And so I've gone through cycles of activities that ultimately became my hobby, but oftentimes I'm self-taught in those areas. And foreign languages, I love to play piano. I taught myself piano. Other things. But so to kind of give you that background, I started with Mandarin. This was near the end of medical school. Someone had said passively, Mandarin's the hardest language to learn. And so I took it as a challenge. And the other half of me was like, well, if it really is the hardest language to learn, I better get started because this is something that I think would be cool to do. And so actually, after jumping into it, it wasn't as difficult as people say. And it's not because I have a great memory or that I'm really good with languages, but it's because I honestly think Mandarin is not as hard as people say. The only part that makes it really hard is the reading because there's no alphabet. You have to literally memorize thousands of characters. But for an English speaker, Mandarin is not that tough. The syntax and grammar is very similar to what we use in English. It's a subject, verb, object, SVO language. So just as we would say, I ate an apple, subject, verb, and object is the same in Mandarin as compared to Korean where it's SOV or Japanese or Hindi, where you have some weird grammar rules, split ergativity. But anyway, that's Mandarin. And then life insurance, I was approached by a salesman who was trying to sell me life insurance. I'll give anyone the time of day to hear their pitch, but I was skeptical. And so, long story short, before buying the product that he was trying to pitch to me, I did a lot of reading and then it just opened up a world to me. It was very fascinating. And I said, I'm just going to keep reading. This is interesting stuff. I was so far away from what he was trying to sell me because I followed the rabbit hole. But at the end of my studies, I realized, I think I've studied enough to go take the life insurance exam. And that's what I did. Took it and passed it. And I just kept the credential. I don't do anything with it, but.
Did you sell yourself life insurance?
I did.
That's great. That's awesome. How many languages do you speak?
I can speak Spanish and Mandarin pretty comfortably. French I took in high school. I can still have a conversation in French, but it's not as strong as my Mandarin or my Spanish. I've studied Korean. I can still read and write Korean pretty comfortably. My speaking is rusty. I've studied Tagalog. Most recently, Hindi has been my focus. Urdu and Hindi are pretty similar. Just the script is different and maybe 20% of the vocab is different, but otherwise a lot of overlap. And then those are all the languages that I've sat down to actually study. Otherwise, I know some phrases and Russian and Japanese and other languages. But
so you have 24 hours in a day, just like everybody else. It seems like your day is absolutely packed with learning and working and ETA. Do you have any hobbies?
Yeah, love to spend time with my wife. We've been doing some traveling together, so that's always fun. Basketball is probably my biggest hobby, probably my first passion. I still love to play basketball. I play as often as I can, usually only on weekends nowadays, but I still play piano almost every day. Really enjoy music production, creating instrumentals on computer software, as well as playing classical and jazz piano. But yeah, those are my main hobbies. I mentioned the languages, of course, but yeah, I try to maintain my hobbies. I hope to keep them going for as long as I can. I don't have any kids yet, so I'm expecting that once that happens, then maybe I'll shed some of the other hobbies.
You have a lot of languages to teach.
Right.
That's phenomenal. I would love to end with how do you see yourself giving back? I think it's super important to recognize the opportunity that we have, specifically where we operate. Looking back, there were times in my life where people reached backwards and said, "Hey, come on up." So I'm hyper focused on the opportunity for the next generation. How do you see giving back that has a meaningful impact? And I say meaningful because it's not just donating cash somewhere. It's how can you take what you've accomplished and pass down or reach back, or that opportunity, pathway, road that you paved to the next generation?
Giving back is very important to me. I think one way is through mentorship, and that's what I've decided to do. Most recently, I've kind of formalized it by partnering with the public schools in the Frisco area. I live in Plano, Texas, but Frisco is a neighboring city. And I work with a handful of students there. The group that I'm with in particular, these are high school students, by the way. They want to pursue a career in medicine. And so we have regular meetings, usually just once a month. But that's one way that I've chosen to give back. I like this kind of mentorship because it allows me to have a close relationship with someone, and it'll really give me an opportunity to pour into that person and give them a chance to call me up, or, have an open door opportunity for them to ask me anything and everything. For example, I didn't know anything about being a doctor growing up. I feel like it's serendipitous that I even love what I do, because I easily could have not. A lot of people in undergrad who declared themselves as pre-med ended up not actually finishing. Same with med school. And so, yeah, that easily could have been me. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't even know that in residency you had to do 24-hour shifts. If I had heard that in high school, that would have been enough for me to say, actually, I don't want to be a doctor because I love my sleep too much. But it's nice to be able to give these high schoolers an opportunity to see what it's really like to be a doctor. They've come into the hospital dozens of times to shadow me specifically. And I just try to give them as much information as I can so that they can make the decision that they want for themselves in terms of their career path.
That's great. All right. One last question.
Let's hear it.
What is your interpretation of dreams?
Interesting question. Dreams. Well, I think a dream it's what there are a lot of different ways you can answer this, but I'll go this direction. I'll say that a dream is what you want the future to look like. It's a representation of what you hope reality would look like. It's assuming we're talking about good dreams, of course.
Yeah. Or bad, because
that's true.
They do happen. So what are bad?
That's true.
Dreams are dreams.
That's true. Yeah. So at a high level, I would say it's a representation of a potential reality, and we have the power to realize that representation. In other words, make the dream come true. But until you do that, and that's going to require some activation, energy, and effort. But until you realize that dream, it's still only and merely a representation of what could be.
What could be, so is it on the same level as deja vu? Kind of the same thing?
I think in some sense you could frame it that way. My understanding is that deja vu is a specific context. In French, déjà means already, and vu means seen. So something that's already been seen. And so in that context, maybe that's a little bit more literal interpretation, but I think that would refer to a dream that represents something that you've already seen in the past, that type of dream. But in any case, yeah, I think in some aspect you could call it deja vu as well.
Same state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Stephen, thank you. I really appreciate your time. This has been incredible. Thank you for articulating everything here and sharing some wisdom with the listeners on ETA and your day-to-day and what growth looks like for you, and you're a real inspiration. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on your platform. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Legal disclaimer: the views and opinions and statements expressed in this podcast are those of individual speakers and do not reflect the views of their organizations or the producer. This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be construed as medical, financial, legal, tax, or investment advice. You should always consult appropriate professionals before making decisions related to your health, finances, business, or legal matters. References to any companies or services do not constitute endorsements. The producer and participants disclaim all liability for actions taken based on this content and make no representations as to its accuracy or completeness.